On a scorching July afternoon in Riverside, Ohio, the kind of day where the asphalt shimmered with heat waves and cicadas screamed from every tree, 3-year-old Emma Martinez made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. She slipped through the wooden gate of her backyard, a gate her mother Sarah had reminded herself 100 times to fix, while Sarah was busy hanging laundry on the clothesline, humming along to the radio playing somewhere in the distance. Emma's pigtails bounced rhythmically as she wandered toward the commotion she heard coming from the yard next door. Her tiny fingers clutched Mr. Floppy, the stuffed bunny that went everywhere with her, its once white fur now gray from countless adventures. The toddler was drawn by the sound of a deep, authoritative voice shouting commands that meant nothing to her innocent ears but seemed interesting enough to investigate. Next door, Officer Jake was in the middle of an intensive training session with Max, his German Shepherd partner of 5 years. Max wasn't just any police dog. He was a legend at the Riverside Police Department. With 92 successful apprehensions under his collar and a reputation for never backing down, the other officers had nicknamed him the Beast. Standing 30 inches at the shoulder and weighing a muscular 95 pounds, Max was an intimidating sight even to grown men. His black and tan coat rippled over powerful muscles as he executed pursuit drills with mechanical precision. Officer was running Max through high-stress scenarios, simulating a fleeing suspect. He had set up obstacles in the yard, and Max was performing flawlessly, his focus laser-sharp, his prey drive fully activated. This was what Max lived for: the chase, the capture, the praise from his handler. Felt that familiar surge of pride watching his partner work. They had a bond that transcended the typical human-animal relationship. They'd saved each other's lives more than once in dangerous situations. Then, in a split second that would replay in mind for months to come, everything changed. Max's triangular ears suddenly perked straight up, swiveling toward the property line. His entire body went rigid, shifting from training mode to genuine alert. Followed his dog's gaze and felt his heart drop into his stomach. There, standing at the edge of the neighboring yard, was a tiny girl in a pink sundress, clutching a stuffed animal and staring at them with wide, curious blue eyes. "Max, heel," commanded sharply, but it was too late. Max had already locked onto the new element in his environment, something small, moving, and unknown. In his heightened state of training arousal, Max's instincts took over. The massive German Shepherd bolted toward Emma with the same explosive speed he used to take down fleeing criminals. Blood turned to ice. He sprinted after his partner, screaming commands that seemed to dissolve into the thick summer air. "Max, stop, heel, DOWN." Nothing worked. The dog was a blur of black and tan fur, covering ground at an impossible speed, his powerful legs eating up the distance between him and the child. Emma's mother, Sarah, was shaking out a damp sheet when she heard the commotion. She turned just in time to see the nightmare unfolding in horrifying slow motion. Her daughter, her precious baby girl, standing frozen while what looked like a wolf charged directly at her. Sarah's scream tore from her throat, raw and primal. She dropped the laundry basket, clothes scattering across the grass as she ran toward Emma, knowing with sick certainty that she would never reach her daughter in time. The 72-year-old neighborhood busybody who lived across the street was watering her petunias when she heard the screaming. She looked up to see what she would later describe to news crews as a vicious attack dog going after an innocent baby. Her arthritic fingers fumbled for her phone, already composing the dramatic Facebook post in her head, already tasting the attention she would get from being a witness to tragedy. She hit record on her phone's camera, capturing everything. Other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by Sarah's screams. Tom from 2 houses down started running toward the scene. Jennifer Williams stood frozen on her porch, her hand over her mouth. Old Mr., a Vietnam veteran who'd seen plenty of violence in his day, started toward his garage where he kept a rifle, certain this would end in bloodshed. Max was closing in 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. His ears were pinned back, his focus absolute. To anyone watching, he looked like a predator about to strike. His teeth were visible, his breathing heavy from the exertion. This was a dog in full pursuit mode, a dog bred and trained to take down threats without hesitation. Emma stood completely still. While chaos erupted around her and death charged toward her on four legs, the little girl didn't run. She didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. Her expression was one of pure curiosity, her head tilted slightly to one side as she watched the approaching dog with interest rather than fear. Mr. Floppy dangled from her left hand, forgotten. 15 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. Officer was still sprinting, still shouting, his voice hoarse with panic. Sarah was sobbing, reaching out helplessly, too far away. The neighbors watched in horror, some already turning away, unable to witness what came next. 3 feet separated the massive German shepherd from the tiny toddler. Max's momentum should have carried him into her, should have knocked her to the ground at minimum. But something shifted in that final moment. Max's eyes met Emma's calm, steady gaze. Time seemed to suspend itself, stretching that fraction of a second into an eternity. Then Emma spoke. Her voice was small but clear, cutting through the chaos like a bell. 2 words spoken without fear or hesitation, with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Good boy. The effect was instantaneous and stunning. Max's entire body language transformed mid-stride. His ears came forward, his jaw relaxed. His tail, which had been straight out behind him, began to wag. The fierce pursuit momentum bled away as the massive dog applied his brakes, his paws scrabbling on the grass as he came to a complete stop just inches from Emma. Then, with perfect precision, Max sat down directly in front of the little girl, his tail sweeping back and forth across the ground, his tongue lolling out in what could only be described as a smile. The charging beast had become a gentle pet in the space of 2 heartbeats, transformed by 2 simple words from a 3-year-old child. Emma reached out her tiny hand and placed it on top of Max's broad head, her fingers barely spanning the width of his skull. She smiled, the same smile she gave Mr. Floppy during their tea parties, utterly trusting and completely unafraid. "Good boy," she repeated softly, patting his head. Officer stumbled to a halt 5 feet away, his chest heaving, his face white with shock. Sarah reached them a moment later, scooping Emma into her arms with shaking hands, pressing her daughter's face against her chest as she sobbed with relief. But Emma squirmed in her mother's embrace, reaching back toward Max with one chubby hand. "Good boy," she said again, as if confused why anyone would be upset. Max remained sitting, his tail still wagging, looking up at Officer with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Dropped to his knees, his hands on his partner's shoulders, his mind reeling. In 5 years of working together, through dozens of dangerous situations and hundreds of training exercises, Max had never disobeyed a pursuit command. And he had certainly never stopped himself mid-pursuit because of something a target said. The neighbors slowly emerged from their frozen states, converging on the scene with exclamations of relief and disbelief. But was already on her phone, her video uploaded to Facebook before Sarah's tears had even dried. And she wasn't sharing a story of a miraculous near miss. She was sharing what she believed she'd witnessed, a vicious police dog attacking a helpless child, and her post was already starting to spread like wildfire across social media. As Sarah carried a protesting Emma back toward their house, an officer led a confused Max back to his police vehicle. None of them realized that this moment, these 2 words spoken in innocence, had just set in motion events that would culminate in a courtroom, with a judge's decision that would stun an entire community and create ripples far beyond this quiet Ohio neighborhood. The video was already going viral. The news vans would arrive within the hour. And Max, the heroic police dog who had just demonstrated extraordinary restraint and gentleness, was about to be labeled a dangerous animal facing a death sentence. All because a 3-year-old girl had the wisdom to see what others could not. That sometimes the most fearsome creatures have the gentlest hearts, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply offer kindness in the face of fear. Max skidded to a complete halt inches from Emma, his fierce expression melting away like ice under the summer sun. The massive German shepherd sat down with perfect discipline, his tail creating small dust clouds as it wagged enthusiastically against the dry grass. He leaned forward slightly and gave Emma's outstretched hand a gentle lick, his brown eyes soft and warm. It was the look of a dog who had just found a friend, not a target. Sarah reached them in the next heartbeat, her bare feet torn and bleeding from her desperate sprint across gravel and thorns. She scooped Emma into her arms with such force that the toddler's stuffed bunny tumbled to the ground. Sarah's entire body shook as she clutched her daughter, one hand cradling Emma's head against her chest while her legs threatened to give out beneath her. She couldn't catch her breath. Each gasp came out as a broken sob. "It's okay, Mama," Emma said softly, patting her mother's wet cheek with one small hand. "Good boy. Nice." The child seemed completely unaware that she just faced down what everyone else had perceived as mortal danger. To Emma, it had simply been an opportunity to meet a new dog, something she loved more than almost anything in her small world. Officer Jake stood frozen, his service weapon halfway out of its holster, a movement he didn't even remember making. His face had gone chalk white, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead despite the oppressive heat. In 5 years of partnership with Max, through armed robberies, high-speed chases, and situations where their lives hung in the balance, he had never, not once, seen his dog disobey a direct command. Max was renowned for his discipline, his unwavering focus, his absolute reliability. "Max, what the hell just happened?" whispered, dropping to one knee beside his partner. His hands were shaking as he ran them over Max's head and shoulders, checking for injury, for illness, for anything that might explain the dog's behavior. But Max seemed perfectly fine. In fact, the dog appeared calmer than had seen him in months, his posture relaxed, his breathing steady, his attention fixed on the spot where the little girl had been standing moments before. The neighbors who had witnessed the incident began converging on the scene, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of concern, relief, and confusion. Tom reached them first, placing a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Is she hurt? Should I call 911? "I don't think so," Sarah managed, her voice hoarse. She was running her hands over Emma's arms and legs, checking for injuries, for bite marks, for any sign of trauma. But Emma just giggled and squirmed, more annoyed by the attention than frightened by what had happened. "Emma, baby, are you okay? Did the scare you?" "No scare," Emma said firmly, shaking her pigtails. "Good boy, I want to pet good boy again." But the peaceful resolution of the incident was about to shatter completely. Across the street, stood on her porch, her phone still recording, her face flushed with excitement. At 72 years old, had lived in Riverside her entire life, and nothing interesting had happened on Maple Street in decades. She was the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog, the woman who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing it. Her Facebook page was her throne, and her 847 friends waited eagerly for her daily posts about neighborhood drama. But this was bigger than a property line dispute or someone leaving their trash cans out too long. This was actual news. Fingers flew across her phone screen as she stopped recording and immediately began uploading the video to Facebook. Her caption was brief but inflammatory. "Vicious police dog attacks 3-year-old girl on Maple Street. Child lucky to be alive. Where is the accountability? Share to warn other parents." Hit post and watched with satisfaction as the first likes and comments began appearing within seconds. She didn't mention that the dog had stopped on its own. She didn't include the part where Emma had calmly spoken to Max, or how the dog had sat down gently. This video began mid-charge, showing only a massive German shepherd bearing down on a tiny child, then cutting off just before the peaceful resolution. It was dramatic, frightening, and most importantly too, highly shareable. Within 10 minutes, the video had 50 shares. Within 20 minutes, it had been picked up by the local news scanner account that monitored police activity. Within 30 minutes, It had 2,000 shares and was being discussed on the Riverside Community Watch page, where outraged comments piled up faster than anyone could read them. That dog should be put down immediately. Why are police dogs allowed in residential neighborhoods? That poor baby could have been killed. Sue the police department. My tax dollars pay for this. The comments section became a wildfire of outrage, speculation, and fear. Parents began tagging other parents, warning them to keep their children inside. Someone created a petition demanding Max's immediate removal from service. Another person found Officer's Facebook page and began posting the video on all of his photos, calling him an irresponsible handler. The situation was spiraling out of control at digital speed, and none of the people at the actual scene even knew it was happening yet. Officer helped Sarah get Emma back into her house, his apologies tumbling over themselves. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry. I don't know what happened. Max has never done anything like this. He's the most reliable dog in the department. Please, I need to file a report, make sure Emma is checked by a paramedic." "She seems fine," Sarah interrupted, though her hands were still shaking as she set Emma down in their living room. The little girl immediately toddled over to her toy box and began pulling out her stuffed animals, arranging them in a line on the floor. "Mr. Floppy, meet the good boy," she narrated to herself, making her toys bow to an imaginary dog. Pulled out his radio, knowing he needed to report the incident to his supervisor before it became something bigger. But he was already too late. His radio crackled to life before he could even key the mic. "Unit 12, this is dispatch. Please respond immediately. Chief wants you back at the station ASAP. There's been a complaint filed regarding your K9. Felt his stomach drop. "Copy that, dispatch. En route." He looked at Sarah apologetically. "Ma'am, I need to go, but someone from the department will be in touch. Please, if Emma shows any signs of distress or if you need anything." His phone started ringing. Then it rang again and again. Text messages began flooding in from other officers, from friends, from his sister who lived 3 states away. "Jake, what the hell happened? Dude, you're all over Facebook. Is this real?" Officer looked at his phone in confusion, opened Facebook, and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Video had exploded. It now had over 15,000 shares and had been picked up by 3 local news stations. The comments were vicious, calling for his badge, calling for Max to be euthanized, calling for lawsuits and criminal charges. The video had been edited, manipulated by the algorithm and by selective recording, to show only the most frightening moments without any context. "No," whispered, his face going pale. "No, no, no, this isn't what happened. This isn't." But the narrative was already set. In the court of public opinion, Max had transformed from hero to monster in less than an hour, and there was nothing could do to stop it. He loaded Max into his K9 unit and drove back to the station with his mind racing. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. When he pulled into the parking lot, he saw something that made his heart sink even further: news vans. 3 of them, with satellite dishes extended and cameras already rolling. Reporters rushed toward his vehicle, shouting questions he couldn't process. "Officer, is it true your dog attacked a child? Will Max be put down? Were you negligent in your duties? Does the department plan to pay for therapy for the traumatized child?" Pushed through them without comment, keeping his body between Max and the cameras, and entered the station through the back entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and hostile. Officers he'd worked with for years avoided his eyes. His supervisor, Captain, was waiting in her office with the chief of police, Robert, and the city attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Richardson. "Sit down," Chief said, his voice flat and professional but lacking its usual warmth. "We need to talk about your future with this department, and we need to talk about Max." In the holding area, Max was taken to the K9 facility's isolation kennel, a space usually reserved for dogs who were injured, sick, or under investigation. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, and for the first time in his 5 years of service, Max was alone, confused, and separated from his partner. He whined softly, pressing his nose against the chain link, not understanding what he had done wrong, not understanding why the little girl's kindness had led to this cold, empty room. Outside the station, the news crews were setting up for their evening broadcasts, was giving interviews, describing Emma as traumatized, even though she'd never actually spoken to the child or her mother. The story was taking on a life of its own, growing more distorted with each retelling. By 6 o'clock that evening, every major news outlet in Ohio was running the story. By 7 o'clock, it had gone national. By 8 o'clock, the Riverside Police Department's phone system had crashed from the volume of angry calls demanding action. A protest was being organized for the next day. The mayor was fielding calls from city council members demanding answers. And in a downtown law office, the city attorney was already drafting the paperwork that would seal Max's fate. The motion was filed at 9:47 p.m. The City of Riverside versus Max, Badge K947. The charges: reckless endangerment, failure to obey handler commands, and posing an imminent threat to public safety. The requested remedy: immediate removal from service and euthanasia. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away in Judge's courtroom. A judge with a reputation for being tough on animal cases. A judge who had her own painful history with dog attacks. A judge who had never, in 15 years on the bench, ruled in favor of a dog accused of aggression. Max's fate was sealed before officer even knew the legal process had begun. And somewhere in that cold, isolated kennel, a hero dog who had only done what his heart told him was right lay with his head on his paws, waiting for his partner to come back and explain why everything had gone so terribly wrong. The 2 words that had stopped an attack had started a war, and nobody, not Emma, not Sarah, not officer, and certainly not Max, was prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. The subpoena arrived at Sarah Martinez's door on a gray Monday morning, delivered by a stone-faced process server who refused to meet her eyes. Sarah's hands trembled as she tore open the manila envelope, her coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter as she read the legal jargon that would upend her life. She was being compelled to testify in a hearing that could determine whether Max, the dog who had spared her daughter's life, would live or die. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Mama, why are you crying?" Emma asked from the doorway, Mr. Floppy clutched under one arm, her other hand rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones covered in cartoon puppies. "Nothing, baby," Sarah lied, quickly wiping her tears and folding the legal document. "Mama's just tired." But she wasn't tired. She was terrified. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in courtroom 3B, and Sarah had no idea what she was supposed to say or do. All she knew was that the world had gone insane in the 2 weeks since that July afternoon, and somehow her daughter had become the center of a storm neither of them understood. Across town, in the sterile conference room of an associate's, attorney David was preparing for the fight of his career. At 43 years old, David had handled hundreds of cases, personal injury, civil rights, contract disputes, but never anything like this. He'd taken Officer Jake case pro after reading about Max's story in the newspaper, something about it triggering memories of his own childhood dog, who had been wrongfully accused of aggression and put down before his family could fight for him. "We're not just fighting for a dog," David said, spreading crime scene photos, commendations, and training certificates across the conference table. "We're fighting against a narrative that's already been written. The public has decided Max is a monster. We need to show them the truth." Officer sat across from him, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his police uniform hung looser than it had 2 weeks ago. He'd been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the hearing, and the isolation from his brothers and sisters in blue had been crushing. Worse still was the separation from Max. was allowed only supervised visits twice a week to the K9 facility, where Max paced his kennel endlessly, his ribs beginning to show because he barely touched his food. "Max isn't eating," said, his voice cracking. "He doesn't understand why I'm not there. Yesterday during visitation he just pressed against the chain link and whined. David, if they put him down." His voice broke completely. "I won't survive it. Max saved my life 3 years ago during that warehouse raid. He took a bullet meant for me, and now I can't even save his." David placed a firm hand on shoulder. "We're going to save him, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about what actually happened that day. This is about optics, politics, and fear. The city attorney, Richardson, is one of the toughest prosecutors in the county. She doesn't take cases she doesn't think she can win, and she's already won 3 dangerous dog cases this year. Every single one ended in euthanasia." The preliminary hearing had been a disaster. David had barely been allowed to speak while City Prosecutor Richardson, a razor-sharp woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and colder eyes, had presented her case with surgical efficiency. She transformed that July afternoon into a horror story, painting Max as a ticking time bomb and as a negligent handler. Richardson had brought enlarged photographs of Max's teeth, impressive canines that looked menacing when isolated from the gentle dog they belonged to. She'd presented statistics about police dog bite incidents across the country, cherry-picking data that made K9 units seem like public menaces rather than valuable law enforcement tools. She'd even brought in Doctor, a so-called canine behavior expert, who had never met Max but with absolute certainty that German Shepherds were inherently dangerous around children. "This animal weighs 95 pounds, more than 3 times the weight of that precious little girl," Richardson had argued, her voice dripping with manufactured concern as she gestured to a blown-up photo of Emma that made the 3-year-old look even smaller and more vulnerable. The force of impact alone could have caused catastrophic injury, broken bones, crushed organs, traumatic brain injury, death. She'd paused for effect, letting those words hang in the air. "Ladies and we're not here because something terrible happened. We're here because something terrible almost happened, and next time, and there will be a next time if this animal is allowed to continue working, we might not be so lucky." The gallery had murmured in agreement. Parents in attendance had nodded, imagining their own children in Emma's place. The narrative was set. Max was dangerous, unpredictable, a loaded gun without a safety. David had requested to show the full, unedited video of the incident. The bailiff had dimmed the courtroom lights and the projector had flickered to life. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds the room watched in silence. Max's charge, Emma's stillness. Those 2 words, "good boy," Max's immediate transformation. The gentle sit, the tail wag, the peaceful resolution. But when the lights came back up, David had seen something that chilled him. Judge's face remained completely impassive, unmoved by what should have been exculpatory evidence. Her reputation preceded her. 0 tolerance for animal aggression cases, 15 years on the bench, and not a single ruling in favor of a dog accused of dangerous behavior. "Counselor," Judge had said, her voice crisp and cold as she removed her reading glasses to fix David with a penetrating stare. "A stopped clock is right twice a day. One favorable outcome doesn't erase the potential for catastrophic harm. This dog disobeyed direct commands from his handler and charged an unsuspecting child. The fact that he chose not to attack on this particular occasion is irrelevant to the question of whether he poses a future danger to the community." David had tried to argue, but's gavel had come down like a gunshot. "The hearing will proceed as scheduled. The defendant," she'd paused, seeming to catch herself, "the animal in question will remain in isolated custody until a final determination is made. This court is adjourned." Now, sitting in his conference room 2 days before the final hearing, David was painfully aware of how steep the climb ahead would be. He'd filed motions to bring in expert witnesses of his own, K9 trainers, animal behaviorists, even a professor from Ohio State University's veterinary program who specialized in working dogs. He'd subpoenaed Max's complete service record, every commendation, every successful operation. He'd even tracked down the family of the missing autistic boy that Max had found and kept calm for 3 hours, while rescue teams worked to extract them from a collapsed storm drain. But Richardson had blocked or undermined almost everything. She'd filed counter-motions claiming the expert witnesses were biased. She'd submitted her own interpretations of Max's service record, pointing out 3 incidents where suspects had required medical treatment after Max's apprehensions, conveniently omitting that all 3 suspects had been armed and dangerous, and that Max's interventions had likely saved officers' lives. The media circus had only intensified, had become a minor celebrity, appearing on local morning shows to describe the attack she'd witnessed. The fact that she'd never actually spoken to Emma or Sarah didn't seem to matter. News outlets ran with headlines like "Hero Dog" or "Public Menace." And should police K-9s be banned from residential areas? Online petitions, one demanding Max's immediate euthanasia, had gathered 47,000 signatures, while a counter-petition supporting Max had only managed 12,000. The police union was divided. Some officers stood firmly behind and Max, remembering the lives the K-9 team had saved. Others worried about liability, about lawsuits, about the department's public image. Chief, under pressure from the mayor and city council, had remained conspicuously silent, refusing to make any statement in support of Max or... "What's our strategy?" asked, pulling David back to the present moment. "What do we do when we walk into that courtroom on Thursday?" David leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered their options. "We tell the truth. We show them who Max really is. And we pray that somewhere beneath Judge's hard exterior, there's a heart that can still be reached." But even as he said it, David wasn't sure he believed it. He'd done his research on Judge. 7 years ago, her 4-year-old grandson had been mauled by a neighbor's dog at a birthday party, requiring 37 stitches and multiple reconstructive surgeries. The dog had been described as friendly and good with kids, right up until the moment it attacked without warning. Since that incident had presided over 11 dangerous dog cases. All 11 had resulted in euthanasia orders. She was consistent, methodical, and seemingly immune to emotional appeals. David had watched recordings of her previous rulings, looking for any crack in her armor, any sign of flexibility or compassion. He'd found none. "There's something else you should know," David said carefully, sliding a document across the table. "Richardson filed an additional motion this morning. She's requesting that Emma Martinez be brought into the courtroom to testify." Head snapped up. "What? She's 3 years old. What could she possibly testify about?" Richardson claims Emma's psychological state is relevant to determining the level of trauma inflicted. She wants to have a child psychologist evaluate Emma's testimony and body language to determine if the incident caused lasting harm. David's jaw tightened. It's a manipulation tactic. She wants the judge and the gallery to see a small, innocent child in the same room with Max to reinforce the David and Goliath narrative she's building. Pushed back from the table, packing to the window that overlooked downtown Riverside. Below, life continued normally, people walking dogs, children playing in the park, the world spinning on as if Max's life didn't hang in the balance. "This isn't justice," he said quietly. "This is a witch hunt." "Yes," David agreed, "but it's the witch hunt we have to win, so let's get back to work." They worked through the night, building their case piece by piece, preparing for every possible angle Richardson might take. But in the back of David's mind, a cold certainty had taken root. They weren't just fighting the city attorney. They were fighting public opinion, media sensationalism, and a judge whose personal tragedy had hardened her heart against the very animal they were trying to save. Thursday morning loomed like an executioner's appointment, and Max, gentle, heroic Max, sat in his isolation kennel, unaware that his fate would soon be decided by 12 humans in a courtroom. Humans who would weigh his 5 years of service against 2 seconds of perceived danger. Humans who would ultimately decide whether a dog who had stopped himself from harm deserved to live or die. The legal battle was about to begin, and the odds were stacked impossibly high against them. Thursday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to match the cold atmosphere inside courtroom 3B. Sarah Martinez sat in the witness box, her hands twisted together in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue one she usually reserved for job interviews, and had spent an hour that morning trying to tame her dark hair into something respectable. Across the aisle, she could see Officer sitting beside his attorney, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The gallery behind them was packed with reporters, concerned citizens, and curiosity seekers, all waiting to see how this unprecedented case would unfold. Judge sat elevated above them all, her black robes immaculate, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her severe expression. At 62 years old, she'd seen everything the legal system could throw at her, or so she thought. But this case was proving to be unlike anything in her 3 decades of jurisprudence. Ms. Martinez, City Prosecutor Richardson began, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold, "Thank you for being here today. I know this must be difficult for you." Her tone suggested sympathy, but her eyes were calculating, already planning how to use Sarah's testimony to her advantage. "Can you describe for the court what happened on July 15th of this year?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "Emma, my daughter, she slipped out of our backyard. Before I could stop her, she wandered next door where Officer was training his dog. I heard shouting, and when I looked up, her voice caught. I saw Max running toward her. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I ran, but I knew I wouldn't reach her in time, I thought." She couldn't finish the sentence, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You thought your daughter was going to be attacked," Richardson supplied helpfully, handing Sarah a tissue. "And yet, miraculously, she wasn't. Can you explain what happened next?" "Emma just stood there," Sarah said, dabbing at her eyes. "She didn't run or scream. She just looked at Max and said, 'Good boy.' And the dog stopped. He just stopped and sat down." Richardson nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Ms. Martinez, in the 2 weeks since this incident, have you noticed any changes in Emma's behavior? Nightmares, fear of dogs, anxiety?" Sarah opened her mouth to say no, to explain that Emma had been asking about the good boy every single day, wanting to know when she could see him again. But before she could speak, David stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecutor is leading the witness toward a predetermined conclusion about trauma that hasn't been established." "Sustained," Judge said curtly. "Ms. Richardson, rephrase." Richardson smiled thinly. "Of course. Ms. Martinez, has Emma's behavior changed at all since the incident?" This was Sarah's moment. She'd spent the past 2 weeks being painted by the media as a victim, her daughter as a traumatized child. But sitting in that witness box, under oath, with Emma's future mental health at stake, Sarah made a choice that would change the trajectory of the entire case. "Yes," Sarah said firmly, sitting up. "Emma's behavior has changed, but not in the way you're suggesting." She looked directly at Judge. "My daughter has autism spectrum disorder. She was diagnosed when she was 2 years old. Emma doesn't communicate the way other children do. She's mostly nonverbal, speaks only in short phrases, and has difficulty connecting with people." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "But Emma has always connected with animals, especially dogs." The courtroom went completely silent. Even Richardson seemed momentarily thrown off her script. This wasn't in any of the pretrial documents. Sarah had never mentioned Emma's diagnosis to the police, to the media, or to anyone outside her immediate family and medical team. "For the past year," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out now in a rush, "Emma has been in animal-assisted therapy. Twice a week she works with a certified therapy dog named Biscuit. Her therapist, Dr. Lisa, has been teaching Emma how to interact safely with dogs, how to read their body language, how to stay calm around them. Those two words, good boy, that's exactly what Doctor taught her to say. David was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is clearly relevant testimony that directly impacts the court's understanding of what occurred. I'd like to request that Dr. Lisa be called as a witness. Judge's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in her eyes, interest, perhaps, or surprise. Ms. Richardson, do you object? Richardson's jaw was tight. This testimony was dismantling her carefully constructed narrative of a helpless victim and a dangerous dog. The state has no objection, Your Honor, though we question the relevance of. The relevance seems quite clear to me, Counselor, interrupted. The child's training and experience with animals directly informs whether this was a case of a dangerous dog being miraculously restrained or a trained child successfully de-escalating a situation. Bailiff, please call Dr. Lisa to the stand. 20 minutes later, Dr. Lisa entered the courtroom carrying a tablet and a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. At 38 years old, she was one of the leading specialists in animal-assisted therapy for children with autism in the tri-state area. She'd worked with Emma since the child was 2, watching her transform from a withdrawn, nonverbal toddler into a little girl who could express herself. But only, it seemed, with animals. After being sworn in, Doctor settled into the witness box with the calm confidence of someone who'd as an expert witness many times before. David, no relation, though they joked about it in the hallway, began his questioning. Doctor, can you explain what animal-assisted therapy involves, particularly for children on the autism spectrum? Certainly, Doctor said, her voice clear and professional. Many children with autism struggle with social communication and emotional regulation. They find human interaction overwhelming or confusing. But animals, particularly dogs, communicate in ways that are often more accessible to these children, through body language, tone, and consistent behavioral patterns. In Emma's case, she was almost entirely nonverbal when I first began working with her. She wouldn't make eye contact with humans, wouldn't respond to her name, existed in her own world. But when I introduced her to Biscuit, our therapy dog, something changed. Doctor pulled up her tablet and, with the court's permission, projected a video onto the courtroom screen. The gallery leaned forward, watching as a younger Emma, barely 2 years old, sat in a therapy room, rocking back and forth, unresponsive to the adults around her. Then a golden retriever entered the frame. Emma's head came up immediately. Her rocking stopped. She looked directly at the dog, direct eye contact that she wouldn't make with any human, and reached out her hand. This was our breakthrough moment, Doctor explained as the video played. Over the next year, I worked with Emma twice weekly, teaching her specific protocols for interacting with dogs. We used positive reinforcement, repetition, and clear commands. Good boy or good girl was the primary phrase I taught her, a universal calming signal that works with most dogs because they associate those words with praise and relaxation. The video showed Emma's progression, learning to approach dogs slowly, to offer her hand for sniffing, to use calm voice tones, to recognize when a dog was happy, scared, or agitated. The transformation was remarkable. The withdrawn toddler became animated, engaged, speaking short phrases to the dogs that she wouldn't speak to humans. Dr. David continued, in your professional opinion, when Emma encountered Max on July 15th and said, "Good boy," was she acting on instinct or training? Training, absolutely, Doctor said without hesitation. Emma's response was textbook perfect for what I taught her. She didn't run, which could trigger a dog's chase instinct. She made herself small and non-threatening. She used a calm, clear voice with the exact phrase we'd practiced hundreds of times. And most importantly, she maintained eye contact, which dogs interpret as confidence and leadership. Doctor leaned forward, her expression intense. What happened that day wasn't luck or a miracle. It was a trained child successfully applying therapeutic techniques in a real-world situation. Emma did everything right. Richardson stood for cross-examination, her expression skeptical. Doctor, you're saying a 3-year-old child with autism successfully managed a situation that a trained police officer couldn't control. I'm saying, Doctor replied calmly, that Emma and Max were both responding to their training. Officer was trained to command his dog in law enforcement situations. Emma was trained to calm dogs in therapeutic contexts. The difference is that Emma's approach was exactly what Max needed in that moment, a calm, clear signal that she wasn't a threat. Sometimes, Ms. Richardson, simplicity is more effective than complexity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge's gavel came down sharply. Order. Doctor, I have a question. The judge leaned forward, and for the first time her severe expression softened slightly. In your professional experience, is this level of intuition with animals common in children with autism? More common than most people realize, Your Honor, Doctor said. There's substantial research showing that individuals on the autism spectrum often have heightened sensitivity to nonverbal communication, which makes them exceptionally attuned to animal behavior. They can read body language and emotional states in animals that neurotypical individuals miss entirely. Emma doesn't just like dogs, she understands them on a level most adults never achieve. Judge sat back, her fingers steepled under her chin, her mind clearly working through the implications of this testimony. The case she'd thought was straightforward, dangerous dog, innocent child, negligent handler, had suddenly become far more complex. David seized the moment. Your Honor, I'd like to request an unusual demonstration. With Ms. Martinez's permission, I'd like Emma brought into a controlled environment with Max, under full supervision, so the court can observe their interaction directly. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Richardson jumped to her feet, objecting strenuously. Your Honor, this is a circus act, not a legal proceeding. You cannot possibly be considering putting a toddler in a room with an animal that's been deemed dangerous. But Judge raised her hand for silence, her eyes fixed on Sarah Martinez. Ms. Martinez, this is your decision. No one will force you to expose your daughter to any situation you're uncomfortable with. But I'll be honest with you, seeing this interaction firsthand would significantly inform my ruling. What do you say? Sarah looked at Officer, whose entire future hung on her answer. She looked at the reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks. She looked at Doctor, who gave her an encouraging nod. Then she thought about Emma, who'd asked about the good boy every single day for 2 weeks, who drew pictures of a big dog with a crayon at their kitchen table, who'd never shown a single moment of fear. Yes, Sarah said quietly. Emma would want to see her friend again. I give my permission. Judge nodded slowly. Very well. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., we'll reconvene in the courthouse's secure conference room. Bailiff, make the arrangements. Court is adjourned until then. As the gavel fell, Officer buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by a sudden surge of hope. Max would get one more chance. And Emma, beautiful, special Emma who saw the world differently than everyone else, would be the one to give it to him. In his isolation kennel, Max lifted his head as if sensing that something had changed, that somehow, somewhere, someone was fighting for him. His tail gave a single, hopeful wag. Tomorrow would determine everything. The courthouse conference room had been transformed overnight into a controlled demonstration space. Veterinary technicians had set up observation equipment, Doctor had arranged her monitoring tools, and courthouse security had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter. As 9 o'clock approached on Friday morning, the tension in the room was palpable enough to taste. But before the demonstration could begin, David stood and addressed Judge with an unexpected request. Your Honor, before we proceed with observing Emma and Max's interaction, Officer has requested permission to testify. There's crucial background information about Max that the court needs to hear, information that directly impacts how we understand this dog's character and capacity for judgment. Judge glanced at her watch, then at the anxious faces around the room. Richardson looked irritated. already opening her mouth to object but raised a hand. "I'll allow it, but keep it brief, counselor. We have a child coming in shortly, and I don't want to keep her waiting." "Thank you, Your Honor," David said, then turned to, "Officer, please take the stand." Jake stood on shaking legs, carrying a worn cardboard box that he'd brought from home that morning. He'd barely slept, knowing that this might be his only chance to make people understand who Max really was. As he settled into the witness chair, he placed the box on his lap, his hands protective over it like it contained precious treasure. In a way, it did. It contained Max's entire history, the story that nobody knew, the truth that could save his partner's life. "Officer," David began gently, "how long have you been working with Max?" 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days, said immediately, his voice thick with emotion. "I know the exact day because it was the day my life changed, the day I met the bravest soul I've ever known." "Tell us about that day," David prompted. Took a deep breath, opened the box, and pulled out a manila folder marked with an evidence number from 5 years ago. Max wasn't always a police dog. Before he came to me, he was evidence in a criminal case, the largest dogfighting ring bust in Ohio history. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department raided a property in rural Ohio and found 23 dogs, most of them dead or dying. Max was 6 months old. He pulled out photographs, and even the hardened reporters in the observation gallery gasped. The images showed a puppy, barely recognizable as the magnificent German Shepherd who now sat in isolation, covered in scars, mange, and wounds in various stages of infection. Ribs protruded sharply through damaged skin. One ear was torn nearly in half. But it was the dog's eyes in those photos that haunted everyone who looked at them. Empty, defeated, devoid of hope. "Max was what they call a bait dog," continued, his voice breaking. "In dogfighting operations, they use bait dogs to train the fighters to teach them how to attack and kill. Bait dogs are chosen specifically because they won't fight back. They're too gentle, too submissive, too kind. The fighters tear them apart while their owners watch and take notes on technique." He had to stop, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Max was tortured for the first 6 months of his life. Every single day, he was thrown into a ring with dogs twice his size who'd been starved and beaten into aggression. And every single day, Max refused to fight back. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled crying from several observers. Sarah Martinez had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Even Judge Stern's expression had cracked, her jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Pulled out veterinary records, his hands shaking as he laid them on the witness stand's ledge. 347 stitches, 2 broken ribs that healed incorrectly, permanent nerve damage in his left hind leg, psychological trauma so severe that the rescue veterinarian recommended euthanasia because she didn't think Max could ever be rehabilitated. He looked up, his eyes blazing with fierce love and pride. But I saw something in him. When I visited the shelter where he'd been taken after the raid, all the other dogs were barking, aggressive, terrified. Max just sat in the back of his kennel and looked at me. And in those eyes, those same eyes that had been so empty in the evidence photos, I saw something incredible. I saw forgiveness. I saw hope. I saw a dog who'd been given every reason to hate humans, to fear them, to attack them, and instead he was just waiting. Waiting for someone to show him that not all people were monsters. David let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of words to settle over everyone. Then he asked quietly, "What happened next?" "I adopted him," said simply. "I wasn't even a K-9 officer then, I was just a patrol cop who'd always loved dogs. I took Max home, spent every off-duty hour working with him. I expected it to take years, expected him to be reactive, aggressive, traumatized. But Max," he smiled through his tears, "Max forgave us, all of us. Humanity. Within 6 months he was playing fetch. Within a year he was letting children at the park pet him. Within 2 years, he'd passed every temperament test the K-9 Academy could throw at him with perfect scores." Pulled out another folder, this one bursting with certificates, commendations, and official documents. Max didn't just become a police dog. He became the best police dog our department has ever had. But here's what most people don't know, what isn't in the press releases or the news stories. Max wasn't trained for aggressive apprehension. He was trained for victim assistance. This caught Judge's attention sharply. "Explain that, officer." "There are different specializations for K9 units, Your Honor. Some dogs are trained primarily for detection, drugs, explosives, that kind of thing. Others are trained for aggressive apprehension, taking down fleeing suspects, protecting officers in dangerous situations. Max has those skills, yes, but his primary training and certification is in victim assistance. He's specifically trained to work with vulnerable populations, children, elderly citizens, people with disabilities, trauma victims." Pulled out a thick file of case reports. In the last 5 years, Max has been deployed on 92 victim assistance calls. He's comforted children who witnessed domestic violence. He sat with elderly Alzheimer's patients who wandered away from care facilities, keeping them calm until help arrived. He's worked with sexual assault survivors during interviews when they were too traumatized to speak to detectives. His voice grew passionate. "Last year there was a case. A 7-year-old autistic boy named went missing during a camping trip. Search and rescue spent 8 hours combing the woods. We finally found wedged in a collapsed storm drain, hypothermic and nonverbal, too scared to make a sound even though rescuers were calling for him." Pulled out a photograph and held it up. A small boy wrapped in an emergency blanket, his arms wrapped tightly around Max's neck, both of them covered in mud. Max found him by scent tracking. But here's the important part. That storm drain was unstable, partially flooded, pitch black. The rescue team needed 3 hours to safely extract them, was terrified, shutting down, going into shock. His parents told us he couldn't be touched when he was overwhelmed. Physical contact made his panic worse. Voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Max climbed into that drain, against my commands I might add, and laid down next to in freezing water for 3 hours. Didn't move, didn't leave. Just stayed there, keeping that little boy warm and calm with his presence. When they finally got them out, wouldn't let go of Max. His first words in hours were 'good dog.'" The parallel to Emma's situation was unmistakable, and David made sure to highlight it. "Officer, in your professional opinion, when Max approached Emma on July 15th, what was his intent?" "He was doing exactly what he's been trained to do," said firmly. "Max wasn't charging Emma to attack her, he was approaching to assess and assist. Look at the unedited video footage. His ears were forward, not pinned back. His tail position was neutral to high, not tucked or rigidly horizontal. His mouth was open in a relaxed pant, not closed in aggressive focus. Everything about his body language says investigating an unknown variable, not pursuing a threat." He leaned forward intensely. And the moment Emma gave him a clear signal, good boy, Max's training kicked in perfectly. He recognized a calm child using appropriate dog communication. He assessed that she wasn't in distress or danger. He sat to show he was non-threatening. That wasn't a miraculous accident. That was 5 years of intensive training working exactly as designed. Richardson stood for cross-examination, her expression skeptical but noticeably less hostile than before. Even she seemed affected by testimony. "Officer, this is all very touching, but you admit that Max disobeyed your direct commands that day. How can you claim he was following his training when he ignored his handler?" Met her gaze steadily. "Because dogs don't operate on simple if-then programming, Ms. Richardson. They make judgments. Max has been trained to prioritize the safety of vulnerable individuals above all else, even above my commands. In that moment, he assessed that Emma was a vulnerable child who needed gentle approach, not aggressive response. He overrode my panicked commands because his training told him I was wrong." He paused, and he was right. If Max had been aggressive, if he had meant Emma harm, my commands wouldn't have stopped him anyway. No command would have. But Emma's kindness did. A 3-year-old child understood how to communicate with Max better than I did in that moment, and Max responded appropriately to her signals rather than my fear. Richardson pressed harder. But what about next time, officer? What happens when Max makes a judgment call and he's wrong? What happens when he approaches a child who runs, who screams, who triggers his prey drive? Max doesn't have a prey drive, said flatly. It was beaten out of him in that fighting ring. He physically cannot chase running prey. We've tested it extensively. Rabbits, squirrels, even cats can run past him and he doesn't react. The abuse he suffered rewired his instincts. He's literally incapable of the aggressive chase behavior you're describing. He pulled out the final document from his box, Max's complete psychological evaluation from the police K-9 program's certified animal behaviorist. This is a professional assessment that concludes Max has the lowest aggression scores and highest empathy scores of any working dog the evaluator has tested in 23 years. The report specifically notes that Max's trauma history makes him exceptionally attuned to distress in others and highly unlikely to engage in aggressive behavior toward non-threatening individuals. Judge took the document, reading it carefully, her expression unreadable. The courtroom waited in breathless silence as she turned pages, absorbed in the professional evaluation that contradicted everything the prosecution had claimed about Max's dangerous nature. Finally, she looked up. "Officer, I have one question. Given everything Max has endured, given his trauma and his history, how is it possible that he's not reactive, not aggressive, not damaged beyond repair?" Smiled sadly. "Because, Your Honor, some souls are just born good. Some beings have a capacity for forgiveness and love that transcends logic. Max could have become vicious. He had every right to hate humanity. Instead, he chose, and I believe it was a choice, to see the best in us, to give us chances we probably don't deserve." His voice broke. Max looks at every person he meets as a potential friend, not a potential threat. Even after everything he's been through, he still believes people are fundamentally good. He saved my life 3 years ago by taking a bullet meant for me, and he spent every day since proving that kindness and strength aren't opposites. They're the same thing. The testimony ended, but the impact lingered in the room like a physical presence. Judge sat back, her face showing more emotion than anyone had seen from her in years. Even the hardest hearts in the observation gallery had been moved. Emma would arrive any minute for the demonstration. But now, everyone in that courtroom saw Max differently. He wasn't a dangerous animal that needed to be destroyed. He was a survivor, a hero, and perhaps most importantly, a soul who understood vulnerable children because he himself had once been vulnerable and broken. The question was no longer whether Max was dangerous. The question was whether humanity deserved a dog like him at all. Judge called for a 30-minute recess before Emma's arrival, her voice tight and controlled as she announced the break. She stood from the bench with mechanical precision, her black robe swirling behind her as she disappeared through the door to her chambers. The moment the heavy oak door closed behind her, the iron composure that had defined her 30-year judicial career shattered completely. She made it to her private bathroom just in time, gripping the cold porcelain sink as her body shook with suppressed sobs. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, eyes red-rimmed, makeup smeared, the severe mask she wore in public crumbling to reveal the raw pain beneath. The judge, known throughout Ohio for her unflinching rulings and steel-trap mind, was crying in her courthouse bathroom like a traumatized child. "Pull yourself together," she whispered harshly to her reflection. "You're a professional. You don't get to fall apart." But officer testimony had ripped open a wound she'd spent 7 years carefully sealing shut, and the memories were flooding back with devastating clarity. Michael, her grandson, 4 years old, with his father's dark curls and his mother's green eyes, laughing at a birthday party in a sunny backyard. The neighbor's golden retriever, a dog the family had owned for 6 years, a dog that had never shown a moment of aggression, a dog that parents had let their children crawl all over during countless. And then, without warning, without provocation that anyone could identify, the dog had lunged at Michael's face. could still hear the screaming, her daughter's anguished wails, the other children's terror, her own voice shouting for help as she pressed dish towels against her grandson's face, watching them turn red with shocking speed. 37 stitches across his cheek, forehead, and jaw. 3 reconstructive surgeries. Years of therapy for the nightmares that still woke him screaming in the middle of the night. Michael was 11 now, a withdrawn boy who flinched when dogs barked on television, who couldn't attend friends' houses if they had pets, whose childhood had been defined by fear and scarring. The dog's owners had insisted it was a freak accident, that Buddy had never hurt anyone before, that he must have been startled or in pain, but had seen the animal control reports, read the veterinary evaluations. There was no medical explanation, no clear trigger, just a good dog who'd done something terrible in a single moment of unpredictability. The dog had been euthanized, the family had moved away, and had built her judicial reputation on the belief that no amount of past good behavior could erase the potential for catastrophic harm. 11 dangerous dog cases in 7 years. 11 euthanasia orders. 11 times she'd prioritized public safety over pleas for mercy, because she'd seen firsthand what happened when people trusted the wrong dog. She'd been certain, absolutely certain, that she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting other children from experiencing what Michael had endured. But now, standing in her bathroom with mascara running down her face and her hands shaking, wasn't certain of anything anymore. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her spiral. "Judge, it's..." Her law clerk's voice was gentle, concerned. "May I come in?" Quickly splashed cold water on her face, grabbed a tissue, and tried to repair the damage before opening the door. No relation to either the attorney or the therapist, though they'd all shared a laugh about the coincidence, had been clerk for 3 years. At 29, she was sharp, ambitious, and possessed an uncanny ability to read her boss's moods. Took one look at's face and closed the chamber's door behind her. "Oh, Judge, you can't be objective on this case, can you?" Sank into her leather desk chair, suddenly feeling all of her 62 years. "I thought I could be. I've handled my personal feelings for 7 years, but that officer's testimony..." She pressed her fingers against her temples. The way he described Max's history, the abuse he survived, the way he chose forgiveness over hate, it's making me question everything I've believed since Michael's attack. Sat down across from her, choosing her words carefully. "With respect, Judge, Michael's situation was fundamentally different from what happened with Emma Martinez. The dog that attacked Michael had no warning signs, no context. But Max, everything in his history, his training, his service record, it all points to a dog with exceptional judgment and restraint." "Or," countered sharply, falling back on her familiar arguments, "it points to a dog who's been lucky so far. One good outcome doesn't guarantee the next. Michael's attack was unprovoked too. Buddy had been around children hundreds of times before that day. What makes Max any different?" "The difference," said slowly, "is that Max actively chose not to harm Emma when he had every opportunity and biological impulse to do so. He was in prey drive, pursuing what he perceived as a target, and a 3-year-old child stopped him with 2 words. That's not luck, Judge. That's a dog with extraordinary emotional intelligence making a conscious choice." Stood abruptly, packing to her window overlooking the courthouse square below. Parents walked with their children, dogs trotted beside their owners, life unfolding in its ordinary patterns. "You think I'm wrong. You think I've been wrong about all of them." "I think," said carefully, "that your grandson's trauma has shaped your rulings in ways that might not always serve justice. And I think you're terrified right now because you can see that Max isn't like the other dogs you've ruled against, but you don't know how to reconcile that with 7 years of consistent judgments." Turned from the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I rule in Max's favor, what does that say about all the other dogs I sentenced to death? What does it say about the families I told that public safety required their pets to be destroyed? How do I live with the possibility that I might have been wrong? You live with it the same way you've lived with every difficult decision you've ever made, replied firmly. You look at the evidence, you apply the law, and you make the best judgment you can with the information available. But Judge, and I say this with deep respect, you can't let Michael's attack dictate the outcome of every case. Each situation has to be evaluated on its own merits. Before could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from courthouse security. Emma Martinez had arrived with her mother, and Doctor was ready to begin the demonstration. The moment of truth was approaching, and felt wholly unprepared for what she was about to witness. I need to see it for myself, said suddenly, her decision crystallizing. Not through testimony or videos or expert opinions. I need to look into Max's eyes the way Officer did 7 years ago. I need to understand what made him see a salvageable soul instead of a dangerous animal. Look startled. Judge, you're talking about having direct contact with the dog. Is that appropriate? Appropriate? Laughed bitterly. Nothing about this case is appropriate. I'm supposed to be impartial, but I'm carrying 7 years of trauma and guilt into that courtroom. The least I can do is face the source of my fear directly. She straightened her robes, wiped away the last traces of tears, and rebuilt her professional mask piece by piece. But first, we observe Emma's interaction. That child deserves my full attention and an open mind. Stood, placing a supportive hand on her boss's shoulder. For what it's worth, Judge, I think you're incredibly brave for questioning your own certainty. Most people in your position would double down on their beliefs rather than admit they might be wrong. Managed a wan smile. Or I'm a coward who's been hiding behind judicial authority to avoid confronting my own trauma. She took a deep breath. Either way, we're about to find out. Let's go see if a 3-year-old child and a broken dog can teach an old judge some new tricks. They walked together down the hallway toward the conference room where Emma waited. Through the observation window, could see the little girl sitting on her mother's lap, pigtails bouncing as she chattered excitedly about something. Sarah Martinez looked nervous, protective, but also hopeful in a way that made his chest ache. On the other side of the room, secured behind a temporary barrier with Officer and 2 handlers, was Max. The German Shepherd sat at perfect attention, his ears forward, his eyes bright and alert. Even through the glass, could see what it described, the scars that marked his body, the slight favor of his left hind leg where old injuries had healed imperfectly, but also the intelligence and gentleness in his expression that contradicted everything she'd believed about aggressive dogs. Judge, the court bailiff approached respectfully. Everyone's ready whenever you give the word. Doctor has the protocols prepared, and we've got emergency medical personnel standing by as a precaution. Nodded, her throat tight. This was it, the moment that would determine not just Max's fate, but possibly the trajectory of her own healing. She thought about Michael, about the fear that had controlled both their lives for 7 years. She thought about the 11 dogs she'd ordered destroyed, about the families who'd pleaded for mercy she'd refused to grant. She thought about officer testimony, about a dog who'd survived torture and chosen love anyway. Before we begin, said quietly, I want it noted for the record that I'm making an unusual request. After we observe Emma's interaction with Max, I want to meet the dog myself, alone with just Officer present. I need to, she paused, searching for the right words. I need to confront my own fear before I can render a fair judgment. The bailiff looked shocked, but nodded and went to relay the message. Squeezed his arm encouragingly. Richardson, the prosecutor, looked like she wanted to object but seemed to sense that this was a turning point, a moment where opposition would do more harm than good. The judge, who'd built a reputation on being unmovable and severe, was about to do something terrifying. She was about to let her certainty crumble, to face the source of her deepest fear, and to allow a traumatized rescue dog the chance to prove that forgiveness and redemption were possible. Because if Max could overcome his history of abuse to become a hero, if he could look at humans with trust despite every reason not to, then maybe, just maybe, could overcome her trauma too. Maybe she could learn to see past her fear to the truth that had been in front of her all along. That judgment should be based on evidence and character, not on the ghosts of past tragedy. "Let's begin," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Bring in the child. Let's see what wisdom she has to teach us." The secure conference room adjacent to courtroom 3B had been transformed into something resembling a laboratory experiment crossed with a therapy session. Veterinary monitors lined one wall, their screens ready to track Max's heart rate, stress levels, and behavioral indicators. Dr. Lisa had positioned herself near a laptop connected to recording equipment, her fingers poised to document every microexpression, every interaction, every detail that might prove crucial to Max's survival. Security personnel stood at strategic positions, hands resting near, but not on their weapons, ready to intervene if the unthinkable happened. Judge stood behind a glass partition with the attorneys, court officials, and select observers. Her hands gripped the metal railing in front of her so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Beside her, Richardson's face was impassive but tense, while David looked like a man watching his entire career balance on a knife's edge. Officer Jake stood closer to the demonstration area, technically behind the partition, but positioned where Max could see him, a familiar anchor in an unfamiliar situation. The room itself had been carefully prepared. Soft mats covered the floor. The lighting was warm but not harsh. There were no sharp corners, no obstacles, nothing that could cause injury if something went wrong. In the center of the space, a simple chair had been placed for Sarah Martinez, and in the corner, behind a temporary barrier that could be removed at doctor's signal, Max waited with two professional dog handlers. The German Shepherd's behavior was being carefully monitored. His ears were forward and alert, his tail in neutral position, his body language displaying curiosity rather than aggression or fear. One of the handlers quietly noted his respiration rate, 18 breaths per minute, well within normal range for a calm dog. The biometric monitor strapped around his chest showed a heart rate of 72 beats per minute. For comparison, an agitated or aggressive dog would typically show rates exceeding 120. "Are we ready?" Judge asked, her voice barely steady. The question was directed at everyone and no one, a last chance to abort this unprecedented demonstration before they crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Doctor nodded professionally. "All protocols are in place, Your Honor. Emma has been prepared according to the same procedures we use in therapy sessions. She understands this is a friend visit with a dog, which is language she's familiar with and comfortable with." "And if something goes wrong," Richardson interjected sharply, "what's the emergency protocol?" "The handlers are K-9 professionals with 15 years of experience each," Doctor replied calmly. "Officer can issue verbal commands from his position. We have brake sticks, air horns, and other humane intervention tools ready. And Emma herself has been taught an emergency stop protocol that we've practiced extensively. But Ms. Richardson, I want to be clear. Based on every indicator we have, something going wrong is extraordinarily unlikely." Richardson's jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. The die was cast. "Bring in Emma," Judge ordered, her voice barely above a whisper. The door opened and Sarah Martinez entered, holding Emma's hand. The little girl wore her favorite yellow dress, the same one she'd worn the day of the original incident, and had insisted on bringing Mr. Floppy, her stuffed bunny, for moral support. Emma's pigtails bounced as she walked, her blue eyes wide and curious as she took in the unusual room with all its equipment and watching adults. "Mama, where's the good boy?" Emma asked immediately, her voice clear and carrying in the hushed space. It was one of her longer sentences, strung together with purpose and anticipation. Sarah had explained that speaking was difficult for Emma, that words had to matter enough to push through the fog of processing that characterized her autism. Clearly, seeing Max mattered. "He's here, baby," Sarah said softly, guiding Emma to the chair in the center of the room. But we have to follow doctor's rules, okay? Just like with Biscuit at therapy. Okay, Mama, Emma agreed readily, climbing into the chair and arranging Mr. Floppy on her lap with careful precision. Then she looked directly at the partition where Max waited, and her entire face lit up with recognition and joy. I see him. I see the good boy. Behind the observation glass, felt tears prick her eyes. This wasn't a terrified child facing a monster. This was a little girl recognizing a friend she'd been missing. The contrast to her own grandson's ongoing fear couldn't have been more stark. Doctor approached Emma with a warm smile. Hi, Emma. Do you remember what we practiced about meeting dogs? Emma nodded seriously. Stay calm, soft voice. Let him smell first. That's perfect, Doctor praised. Max is a very special dog who helps police officers. He's been waiting to see you too. Are you ready? Yes, Emma said emphatically, then remembered herself and added more quietly, yes, please. Doctor signaled to the handlers, who removed the barrier. Officer took a half-step forward, his entire body taut with anxiety and hope. Max's ears perked up immediately as he spotted Emma across the room. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Max, heel, commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Max stood and moved to left side with perfect precision, his eyes never leaving Emma. Easy, boy, slow approach. The monitors tracking Max's vitals showed a slight elevation in heart rate, 82 beats per minute, consistent with excitement rather than aggression. His body language remained open and friendly, no tension in his shoulders, no rigidity in his spine. Walked Max forward slowly, covering half the distance between the barrier and Emma's chair before stopping. Max, sit. Max sat immediately, his tail still wagging, creating a rhythmic swishing sound against the mat. Stay. Max stayed, but every fiber of his being was focused on Emma, his expression almost hopeful, as if asking permission to approach. Emma watched all of this with rapt attention. Then, without prompting from any adult, she slid down from her chair and took 3 steps toward Max, stopping exactly where Doctor had taught her, 3 feet away, just beyond the range where she'd be in the dog's immediate personal space. The watching adults collectively held their breath. Emma stood perfectly still, maintaining eye contact with Max just as she'd been taught. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle and clear. Good boy. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. Max's entire body language shifted from attentive and waiting to joyful and welcoming. His tail wagged harder. His mouth opened in what could only be described as a smile. But he didn't move from his sit position. Not yet, not without permission. Emma, Doctor coached softly, remember the hand signal for friend. Emma nodded and extended her right hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, the universal sign for a dog to approach and sniff. She held the position steady, no trembling, no fear, just patient invitation. Max, friend, commanded, his voice thick with emotion. Slow approach. Max stood and walked toward Emma with deliberate care, each step measured and gentle. When he reached her, he lowered his head and sniffed her extended hand carefully, his nose working to process her scent. Then, in a gesture that made even Richardson catch her breath, Max sat down again directly in front of Emma and raised his right paw, placing it gently in Emma's palm, a trick had taught him years ago as a greeting for children. He's shaking hands, someone whispered from the observation area, awe evident in their voice. Emma giggled, a bright, pure sound of delight that filled the room like music. Good boy, Max. You're such a good boy. She shook his paw solemnly, then looked back at Doctor. Can I hug him? Doctor glanced at, who nodded. Yes, Emma, but remember gentle hugs and watch his body language. If his ears go back or he seems uncomfortable, you step back. Can you do that? I can do that, Emma confirmed. Then she did something that made every parent in the observation area either gasp or tear up. She carefully set Mr. Floppy on the ground beside her. a significant gesture for a child who took her stuffed bunny everywhere, and approached Max with both arms outstretched. Max remained perfectly still as Emma wrapped her small arms around his neck. The biometric monitor showed his heart rate actually decrease, from 82 to 74 beats per minute, a physiological sign of contentment and relaxation. His tail continued its gentle wag, and he leaned ever so slightly into Emma's embrace, providing support without overwhelming her. "He likes hugs," Emma announced to the room. Then she began signing with her hands, simple ASL signs that doctor had taught her. She signed friend, then good, then love. Max watched her hands with focused attention, his intelligence evident in the way he tracked her movements. Sarah Martinez, still standing by the door, had both hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. This was her daughter, her mostly nonverbal, socially challenged daughter, communicating freely and joyfully with a dog that the world had labeled dangerous. Then Emma did something that no one had anticipated, something that would become the defining image of the entire case. She stepped back from Max, looked him directly in the eyes, and spoke in a clear, strong voice, a voice that strung together more words than Sarah had heard her daughter speak in weeks. "You're not scary, you're nice. People don't understand, but I understand. You're my friend." The room went utterly silent. In that moment, a 3-year-old child with autism had articulated what dozens of adults with law degrees and professional credentials had failed to grasp. That understanding required looking past surface appearances and societal labels to see the truth underneath. Max responded by gently licking Emma's cheek, then lying down at her feet in a position of complete submission and trust. Emma sat down cross-legged beside him, retrieved Mr. Floppy, and proceeded to introduce her stuffed bunny to Max as if they were at a casual, rather than a legal proceeding that would determine life or death. "Mr. Floppy, this is Max. Max, this is Mr. Floppy. You can be friends too," Emma narrated, pressing her bunny's paw against Max's nose. Max sniffed the stuffed animal obligingly, his tail still wagging, playing along with the child's imagination with remarkable patience. Doctor was documenting everything, her professional demeanor cracking as she wiped her own eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying to the observation area, "I've worked with hundreds of children and therapy dogs over 15 years. I have never seen a more textbook-perfect demonstration of mutual trust and communication. Emma is reading Max's body language flawlessly, and Max is responding to her with exceptional gentleness and emotional intelligence. This isn't luck. This isn't coincidence. This is two beings who understand each other on a fundamental level." Officer had dropped to his knees, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs of relief and overwhelming emotion. His partner, his brother, really, was proving to a room full of skeptics what had known all along. Max wasn't dangerous. He was extraordinary. Judge turned away from the observation window, unable to watch any more without completely breaking down. She'd entered this room expecting to see a child bravely tolerating a potentially dangerous animal under controlled conditions. Instead, she'd witnessed something that challenged everything she'd believed for 7 years. Genuine, uncomplicated friendship between a vulnerable child and a so-called dangerous dog. "I need a moment," said hoarsely, stepping away from the window. But before she left, she made a decision that shocked everyone in the room. "When Emma is finished with her visit, I want to meet Max myself. Alone with just Officer. No handlers, no barriers, just me, the officer, and the dog." Richardson's head snapped up. "Your Honor is that wise, your impartiality." "My impartiality," interrupted sharply, "has been compromised since the moment this case landed on my desk. The least I can do is face my fear directly rather than hide behind judicial authority." She looked through the window one more time, watching Emma laugh as Max gently nuzzled Mr. Floppy. "That child is braver than I've been in 7 years. I think it's time I followed her example." The demonstration continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma showing Max various toys, practicing the commands Doctor had taught her, and eventually curling up against Max's side, while Sarah read them both a story. The German Shepherd lay perfectly still throughout, a living pillow for a little girl who'd given him a second chance at life simply by seeing him for who he truly was. When it finally ended and Emma was let out, protesting that she wasn't ready to say goodbye to her friend yet, everyone in the observation area knew they'd witnessed something profound. Something that would change the outcome of this case and possibly reform how dangerous dog proceedings were handled throughout the state. But first, Judge had to face her own reckoning. And Max, the dog who'd survived torture to become a hero, was about to teach a hardened judge the same lesson he'd taught everyone else, that true strength lies in choosing, and that forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds. The conference room had been cleared of everyone except Judge, Officer Jake, and Max. The biometric equipment still hummed quietly in the background, abandoned by technicians who'd been asked to leave. The observation window had been covered with blinds at its request. This moment, this confrontation with her deepest fear, would be private, witnessed only by a man and his dog who had everything to lose. Stood on one side of the room, her judicial robes suddenly feeling like armor that was too heavy to bear. Her hands trembled visibly, and she clasped them together to hide the shaking. Across from her, Max sat calmly at side, his brown eyes fixed on her with an expression she could only describe as patient curiosity. There was no aggression there, no threat, only a gentle intelligence that seemed to see straight through her professional facade to the terrified grandmother underneath. "Your Honor," said softly, "we don't have to do this if you're not ready. Max's fate shouldn't depend on—" "Yes, it should," interrupted, her voice hoarse. "It absolutely should. I've been making life-and-death decisions about dogs for 7 years based on my fear rather than evidence. The least I can do is face that fear honestly before I decide whether your partner lives or dies." She took a shaky breath. "Tell me what to do." Studied her for a long moment, seeing past the severe judge to the wounded woman beneath. "Just stand there. Be honest about your fear. Dogs can sense it anyway, and there's no shame in it. Max has dealt with frightened people before. He knows how to be gentle." "Max, slow approach," commanded. The German Shepherd stood and began walking toward with measured steps, his movement fluid despite the slight limp in his left hind leg, evidence of old injuries that would never fully heal. He covered the distance slowly, giving time to bolt if she needed to, but she forced herself to stand still even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Max stopped 3 feet away and sat down, mimicking exactly what he'd done with Emma. His tail gave a single, slow wag. Then he did something unexpected. He lowered himself into a down position, making himself smaller, less threatening, his chin resting on his paws as he looked up with those impossibly gentle eyes. "He's submitting to you," explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Showing you he's not a threat. Max does this with trauma victims sometimes, makes himself vulnerable to help them feel safe." His vision blurred with tears. "My grandson," she whispered. "Michael, he was 4 when a dog attacked him. A good dog, a family dog. I held him while we waited for the ambulance, his blood soaking through my clothes. He needed 37 stitches, 3 surgeries. He's 11 now and he still has nightmares." "I'm so sorry," said genuinely. "That must have been devastating for your whole family." "It was," admitted, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. "And I've been punishing every dog that came before me ever since. 11 dogs in 7 years, officer. 11 euthanasia orders because I was so certain that no amount of good behavior could guarantee future safety. I told myself I was protecting children like Michael, but standing here now looking at Max—" Her voice broke completely. "I think I was just trying to kill the dog that hurt my grandson over and over again, and I can't anymore. I just can't." She sank to her knees, no longer a judge but simply a woman confronting her trauma. Max's ears perked forward and he looked at as if asking permission. Nodded and Max rose slowly, approaching with exquisite care. He stopped when his nose was inches from her face and gently, so gently licked the tears from her cheek. Who hadn't let anyone see her cry in 7 years, who'd built walls of professionalism and severity to protect her wounded heart, wrapped her arms around Max's neck and sobbed. And Max, who understood trauma in ways most beings never would, simply stood there and let her, his presence solid and comforting, asking nothing in return. "I'm sorry," whispered into Max's fur. "I'm so sorry for every dog I condemned because I was too afraid to see clearly. I'm sorry for almost doing the same thing to you." Max's tail wagged slowly, and he pressed closer to her, not constraining, just supporting, the way he'd done within that storm drain, the way he'd done with Emma just an hour ago, the way he'd probably done with dozens of frightened, hurting people throughout his career. When finally pulled back, her makeup was ruined and her judicial dignity was in tatters, but something fundamental had shifted inside her. She looked at with clear eyes. "Your partner is extraordinary, not despite his trauma, but perhaps because of it. He knows what it means to suffer, so he dedicates himself to preventing others from suffering. That's not dangerous, that's heroic." Dropped to his knees beside them, one hand on Max's shoulder, tears streaming down his own face. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for seeing him." "Don't thank me yet," said, rising to her feet and wiping her face with her sleeve, unconcerned about propriety for the first time in years. "I haven't issued my ruling, but I think we all know how this is going to end." She managed a small smile. "Let's go back to the courtroom. It's time to finish this." 2 hours later, courtroom 3B was packed beyond capacity. News cameras lined the back wall. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with dozens more people standing in the hallway, waiting for word of the decision that would determine Max's fate. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row with Emma on her lap, the little girl drowsy and content after her visit with the good boy. Officer sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly that his fingers were bloodless. Judge entered from her chambers, and the bailiff called the court to order. She settled into her seat, looking out over the crowded courtroom with an expression that was softer than anyone had ever seen on her face. The severe judge who'd presided over 11 euthanasia cases had left something behind in that conference room, perhaps her fear, perhaps her certainty, perhaps simply the armor she'd worn for too long. "This court has heard extensive testimony," began, her voice clear and strong, "regarding the incident on July 15th involving K-9 Officer Max and 3-year-old Emma Martinez. The city has argued that Max poses an unacceptable risk to public safety based on his approach toward a child and his failure to obey handler commands. The defense has argued that Max's actions demonstrated exceptional judgment and restraint, not dangerous unpredictability." She paused, and the courtroom held its collective breath. "In my 30 years on the bench, I've never witnessed anything like what transpired in the demonstration earlier today. I've also never been so personally challenged by a case. I need to disclose something to this court that is a matter of public record but which I've never discussed from the bench." His voice remained steady, but emotion flickered across her face. 7 years ago, my grandson was attacked by a dog at a birthday party. The injuries were severe and the psychological impact has been lasting. Since that incident, I have presided over 11 dangerous dog cases, all of which resulted in euthanasia orders. I believed I was being appropriately cautious, prioritizing public safety above all else. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Richardson looked stunned. This revelation could be grounds for judicial recusal, could undermine every ruling had ever made on animal cases. "However," continued, raising her voice over the murmurs, "this case has forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I have been allowing personal trauma to cloud my judgment. I have been seeking retribution rather than justice, and I have been wrong." The whispers became gasps, gripped the table edge, hardly daring to hope. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming and unambiguous. Max is not a dangerous dog. He is a highly trained professional whose service record is exemplary, whose psychological evaluations show remarkable stability and empathy, and whose response to Emma Martinez, both in the initial incident and in today's demonstration, showed judgment that many humans would fail to exercise. Looked directly at, and there were tears in her eyes. Officer, that Max stopped himself because he recognized a vulnerable child who needed gentleness rather than force. Today, I witnessed that same recognition, that same choice to be gentle when he easily could have been otherwise. Max looked at me, a frightened woman projecting fear and hostility, and chose compassion. That is not the behavior of a dangerous animal. That is the behavior of a remarkable soul. She picked up her gavel, and everyone in the courtroom leaned forward. Therefore, this court rules as follows. The city's motion to have K-9 officer Max removed from service and euthanized is denied in its entirety. The courtroom exploded, collapsed forward onto the table, his shoulders heaving with sobs of relief. David pumped his fist in the air. Sarah hugged Emma close while tears of joy streamed down her face. Even some of the reporters were wiping their eyes. The gavel came down repeatedly until order was restored. Furthermore, she continued, her voice now ringing with authority and purpose, this court is issuing several additional orders. First, K-9 Officer Max is to be officially commended by the City of Riverside for his years of exemplary service. Second, the Riverside Police Department is ordered to develop comprehensive K-9 community outreach protocols, with Max serving as the flagship officer for these programs. She wasn't finished. Third, and most importantly, I am announcing the creation of the Emma and Max Foundation, a program dedicated to training therapy dogs specifically for work with children on the autism spectrum. I have personally secured a grant through the Ohio Judicial Foundation to fund the initial program, and I will be volunteering as a board member. Her voice softened. If a 3-year-old child and a traumatized rescue dog can teach an old judge about forgiveness and second chances, then perhaps we can extend that wisdom to helping other children and animals find the connections they need. She looked at Emma, who was clapping her hands excitedly even though she probably didn't understand everything that was happening. Young lady, you demonstrated more wisdom in 2 words than this court has shown in 7 years of rulings. You reminded us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose kindness in the face of fear. Thank you. Then did something unprecedented. She stood and addressed Officer directly. Officer, I owe you and Max an apology. I almost let my fear destroy something precious. I hope you can forgive me. Stood wiping his eyes, his voice choked. Your Honor, there's nothing to forgive. You gave him a fair hearing. That's all we could ask for. It's more than I gave 11 other dogs, said sadly. But perhaps this ruling can be the first step toward making amends. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell for the final time, and chaos erupted as reporters rushed to file their stories, as community members cheered, as sprinted from the courtroom toward the K-9 facility where Max had been waiting for hours, unaware that his life had just been saved. 6 months later, on a crisp January morning, the Emma and Max Foundation held its ribbon-cutting ceremony at the new therapy facility on the outskirts of Riverside. Emma, now 4 years old and increasingly verbal thanks to continued therapy, stood beside Max wearing a matching yellow vest that declared them both official friends. Officer, back in full uniform and fully reinstated, held Max's leash with pride. Judge, dressed in civilian clothes for once, addressed the crowd of parents, children, therapists, and supporters. 6 months ago, I learned that healing doesn't come from building walls. It comes from having the courage to tear them down. Today, we open a facility dedicated to helping children with autism find their voices through the unconditional love of therapy dogs like Max. She paused, looking toward the back of the crowd where her daughter stood with Michael, had been working with her grandson for months, gently reintroducing him to dogs through carefully controlled therapy sessions. He still had a long way to go, but he'd recently managed to pet a small therapy dog for 30 seconds, a milestone that felt monumental. Max will be splitting his time between his police duties and his work here at the Foundation, continued. He's received his official therapy dog certification, and 12 children are already enrolled in our first program cycle. She smiled, genuine warmth replacing the severity that had defined her for so long. I've also enrolled my grandson Michael in our trauma recovery program. Because if Max can forgive humanity after everything he's suffered, then surely we humans can learn to forgive ourselves and each other. The ribbon was cut. Children and therapy dogs poured into the new facility, barking, laughing, playing together in beautiful chaos. Emma stayed close to Max, her small hand resting on his head as she watched the commotion. Lots of good boys, she observed happily. Yes, baby, Sarah agreed, kneeling beside her daughter. And you helped save the best one of all. Officer watched it all with tears in his eyes, one hand resting on Max's shoulders. His partner had been given a death sentence and received a new purpose instead. Max had transformed from evidence in a criminal case to a bait dog, from a traumatized rescue to a decorated police officer, and now to a therapy dog helping children who saw the world through extraordinary eyes, just like he did. Max's tail wagged slowly as he watched Emma introduce a nervous 5-year-old boy to another therapy dog. The German Shepherd understood his new mission instinctively, to help other vulnerable souls find the same second chances he'd been given, to prove that trauma doesn't define destiny, and to show that the most powerful force in the world isn't aggression or fear. It's the simple choice to be kind. Judge stood beside, and they watched in comfortable silence as Emma worked with the new children, her natural gift for communicating with dogs now being channeled to help others. You know, said quietly, I've made thousands of rulings in my career, but saving Max might be the only one I'll be remembered for, and I'm okay with that. He saved you too, Your Honor replied. That's what Max does. He saves people, sometimes from physical danger, sometimes from their own fears. He's been saving people his whole life. Nodded, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt at peace. Michael was getting help. Max was alive and thriving. Emma and dozens of children like her would benefit from the Foundation. And she had learned that justice isn't about rigid application of rules. It's about having the wisdom to see each situation clearly and the courage to admit when you're wrong. As the January sun warmed the celebration, Emma looked up at Max and said with perfect clarity, "Good boy, Max. You're the best good boy ever." Max licked her face, and she giggled, that bright, pure sound that had filled a courtroom 6 months ago and changed everything. 2 words had stopped an attack. 2 words had started a movement. 2 words had taught a community about forgiveness, redemption, and the extraordinary things that can happen when we choose to see with our hearts instead of our fears. And somewhere in that joyful chaos of children and dogs, of laughter and healing, a 3-year-old girl with autism and a traumatized rescue dog continued their friendship, a friendship that had saved them both and created ripples that would spread far beyond one small Ohio town, touching lives and changing minds about what's possible when we dare to offer kindness in the face of fear. The end.